everyone, how's it going? We're going to get started with chapter 20, the slave trade, in particular the Atlantic slave trade, okay? I probably actually should have made that first slide say instead of slave trade, should have said the Atlantic slave trade, okay? So we've been talking about all elements of this. We've talked about exploration age, we've talked about the Columbian exchange, the triangular trade, we've talked about the development of the Americas. Chapter 19, we talked about what did that new social structure look like, what did that new colonization look like. We even talked about the social hierarchy. Now we're going to talk about very specifically the Atlantic slave trade. I mean, we've alluded to this, we've somewhat kind of talked about it, but now we're going to dive into it more specifically, okay? So I would grab, if you can, a copy of the PowerPoint. I would grab the chapter 20 questions, and I would also, if you can, the essay prompt. We will be touching on the essay prompt for this chapter as well. I won't be going over the entire thing, but I will be touching on that. So if that's assigned for this chapter, I would have those things. And remember my motto, working smarter, not harder. Having those things will save you some time, or at least get you get you started. And then you can go back after the lecture, or you can pause the lecture, and you can work on those. All right, so let's get started. Slavery. You know, this is not a new concept. Slavery did not start with the Atlantic slave trade, and so I want to make that very clear. You know, slavery goes all the way back to before written record. The Romans practiced slavery. The Egyptians practiced slavery. The early River Valley civilizations practiced slavery. As long as there has been an enemy, there has been slavery, okay? So slavery from the beginning of man and conquering one another, there has been slavery. From taking what is not mine has been slavery. Because here's the reality. When you invade your neighbor, you have a couple choices, right? We've talked about this before. You can kill your neighbor, right? Your enemy. You can use them for labor, or you can let them remain free. Well, in a lot of cases, people would kill their enemy. Rarely would they let them remain free, maybe a tributary if they're going to work things out, but often they would enslave them. It's labor. It's you know, I don't want to do the work, so I'm going to make them do the work. So slavery has been around. So the concept of slavery has been around really since the dawn of man. Taking someone else, who usually is my enemy, someone I don't like, someone I don't value, right, and using them for labor, using them for unwanted or less valued work, manual labor, hard labor, right? Okay, but the Atlantic slave trade is going to be different because it is the largest forced migration in history. Okay, they estimate about 13 to 15 million slaves were taken from the continent of Africa, specifically West Africa, and taken across the Atlantic to the Americas. When I say the Americas, North America, South America, and the Caribbean. Now, majority of that is going to go to the Caribbean and South America. Actually, the smallest amount will go to North America, but that is a huge amount. Now, not all of those people survived. Maybe 2/3, half, but still, this is huge. So why we look at this one in particular is the volume. I mean, the sheer volume is just unheard of, okay? And then the racial aspect of that, okay, and what role that played in this, okay? So here we go. So what are the various theories as to why the slave labor was so widely used in the Americas? So let's start with the date range. The date range for this chapter is 1550 to 1800. The geographic location really should be the triangular trade. So you've got Europe, right, who would go to Africa. So you have Africa, and you have the Americas, North and South America, for your geographic locations, okay? Key civilizations, you have Europeans, you have West African kingdoms, and then by Europeans, particularly we're going to look at the English and the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish. They were a big part of this. Who will trade with the West Africans, right, to take these slaves, to take these people from Africa to the Americas and then sell them. So what are the various theories why they did it? So we know they did it. We know they did it. We know that they needed labor. We know that the Native Americans were dying, right? Disease was rampant, killed 90% of the population. So what are some of the theories, okay? And this question is actually the same as your essay prompt. So as I touch on this, I'm going to touch on it more from a question perspective, but I want you to start to look at your essay prompt, which says what are the various theories as to why slave labor was so widely used in the Americas, okay? Which theory is most commonly accepted at present. So your grouping is going to be different theories right? And then within one of those, when you're doing your facts, you're going to want to make sure that you note as one of your facts which one is most widely accepted. So you're going to talk about, so you're going to group the theories, you're going to talk about each theory, okay, or reasons behind each theory, and then which one you're going to put one of your facts or an additional fact, and make sure that you make that point in your essay and your thesis, which one is most accepted. They want you to make sure that you really make that point, which one is the more accurate reason, okay? So here are some of the reasons. There are several schools of thought. There isn't just one, okay, that are very popular. So some felt they were more resistant to disease, that they were better suited for the heavy, labor environment, that they come from a harsh environment, that due to their nomadic lifestyle, where they live, the tribal lifestyle, that they could handle the tropics, they could handle the plantation lifestyle, they could handle, working in the mines and stuff like that. So some people felt that they were more, more durable, resistant to diseases, harder workers, could adapt to the harsh environment. Some people held the prejudice racism aspect of it, which we certainly know was an aspect of that. Europeans did not treat Africans as equals, and they saw, because of their skin, they saw them as secondary. So racism, color of skin, they weren't seen as equals. So white men were humans and were educated, and the way that they justified it is they saw Africans as not human, right? They use that social Darwinism justification. Well, if we don't see them as human, then it's okay, right? If they aren't technically human, then we're okay. Because technically within Christianity, slavery was wrong. Technically, the religious text of Christianity says you're not supposed to enslave one another. Well, how do you get around it? They're not human. All of a sudden, I'm not going against God's word. Do you see? So that is a definite possible theory, okay? Eric Williams has refuted this and has said, kind of that, which was born first? Was slavery born out of racism, or was racism a consequence of slavery? So it's kind of like the chicken or the egg argument. So let me pause there for a second. What do you think? Was it the chicken or the egg thing? Did slavery cause racism, or did racism cause slavery? What do you think? Okay, the answer is, and I kind of gave hint to this at the beginning of the lecture, okay, which is that actually slavery will cause racism. Racism did not cause slavery, because if you look at if you go back to the dawn of man, before empires, people would conquer people, and most of the time those were still the same homogeneous groups, okay? So you might be my enemy, but most likely you had the same skin color I did, you had the same background that I did. So for instance, like Mesopotamia in the River Valley civilizations, those city-states, a lot of them was a similar tongue or language, or even if the tongue or language was different, racially they were the same. They had similar skin colors, so there wasn't the racial difference. So slavery was just motivated by, I don't like you, you're my enemy. I'm going to take advantage of you. And then as people expanded outside their homogeneous regions, right, what starts to happen? Diversity. And skin color starts to change. And so that becomes more and more of a factor, or more and more of a justification, but it wasn't the original justification, if that makes sense, okay? So it definitely furthers or promotes it, or helps justify it in people's mind, especially when your religion says it's wrong. Well, if you're not human, then that's how I justify it, right? It's not slavery then, because you're not really human. That's how they justify it. But if you go back and you look at the dawn of man, slavery's been around. Another common assertion is they were cheap, that this was a cheap way to do it, and the labor needs and the cost, that this was a cheaper way to go. That disease was killing the natives, there was low birth rate, indentured servants only lasted 7 to 10 years, and the Africans were convenient. This is the most accepted, the labor needs cost approach, was most accepted. Now, was this convenient? I would say not necessarily convenient. You gotta sail all the way to Africa. You gotta ship them all the way across the Atlantic. You have about a third mortality rate. The people die, so it's not necessarily cheap. But you did own them for life. The reproduction rate. So from the European perspective, this was the best option because Native Americans were dying and they didn't have enough labor. So from the European perspective, this was the best option. This was cheaper than other options and better than indentured servitude. So this started in the 1500s, and this is going to go all the way through, the 1800s. And Europeans relied upon trading with African tribes. So what happened is, this is another big misconception, is that they believed that Europeans would go and round up these slaves, and that happened very rarely. Actually, most of the time it was tribal warfare. And what would happen is that the rival tribe that won, instead of killing the rival tribe, would take them to the shoreline and sell them. So it was kind of a win-win for them because they got rid of their enemy and they made money off of them. So this was a relatively peaceful exchange where literally the Europeans could just roll up on shore, pay for them, and then load up the slaves, almost like cattle, which is so terrible, but that's how it was for them. So it was a very kind of easy process for them. So initially, the trade was just, remember, as Portugal was finding a route to Asia, initially the trade ports along West Africa were kind of refueling stations, and they would trade other things. But over time, those prisoners of war that the African kings would take would trade with merchants, and that became the #1 thing. And more Europeans would come and trade for those things. They would trade for other things like gold and ivory and timber. So they did trade for other things, but the slaves became the main thing that they were trading for. They did want guns, they did want textiles and things like that, African leaders. So they traded for ivory, they traded for gold, they traded for timber, guns, textiles. There were a lot of different things, but slaves was probably the #1 thing that they wished to trade. And as you can see, it's all along the West Coast. So each tribe did a little bit different, what they would offer. This was heavily skewed toward male. So one of the long-term impacts of the Atlantic slave trade is skewing of the male population. There's going to be a lot more females and not enough males left behind. And the problem with that is that it hurts the long-term population, reproduction population of West Africa, because they're taking so many men. Anybody want to guess why they would take so many men? Yeah, they would take men because of the harsh labor, right? So they would take men because of the plantations and working in the mines. Men were more suited for that. Now, there was an East Coast or Middle East African slave trade going on that actually started long before the Atlantic slave trade, which is European. There was the Islamic slave trade over the Sahara, and that was the Islamic slave trade, okay? And this was more domestic. So you kind of had two slave trades. The Atlantic slave trade was like a waterfall, okay? It was 300 years, so it was kind of short and fast, and it was super heavy. So many people going out so fast, millions and millions going out. The Islamic slave trade was going east toward the Middle East, okay, with Islamic nations and merchants, and it was more of a trickle. So the volume was much lower. And it was like a slow leak in that it was longer over time. This went on for over 1,000 years. And it was actually more heavily females because they needed them for like house servant, domestic servant. So working like within the house, and doing household duties and things like that. So the East African slave trade was more women, Islamic, long-term, but smaller volume. The Atlantic slave trade was with Europeans, shorter, but like a waterfall, much higher volume and really, really fast. So what did the Great Circuit look like? Okay, well, the flow of goods would go between Europeans would go to Africa, gather up the slaves, trade for them, then take them to the Americas, sell them. So most of them would get shipped to the Caribbean, and you'll see that in the video that you'll watch about the Atlantic slave trade in the Middle Passage, and then they would be dispersed from the Caribbean to different plantations or mines that they were bought by, okay, or that they were sold to. All right. So the first leg was from Europe to Africa. The second leg, which is the Middle Passage, is from Africa to the Americas. All right, and ships would go back and forth. They estimate that about 1 in 6 slaves would die during the voyage. This is just an estimate. It's really hard to know exactly. Some took good records, some didn't. A lot of them forged their records. And then the primary things carried on the final stretch, so from Europe to Africa, were, you know, guns, ammunition, rum, shells, things that Africans wanted, and they would trade for the slaves. Then from Africa to Europe, they would trade the slaves. And then from the Americas back to Europe, this is where they would take sugar, coffee, rum, molasses, tobacco, those kinds of things. Okay, and this was then known as the Great Circuit. So as you can see, it starts in Europe, they go to Africa, load up on slaves, travel to the Americas, okay, mostly to the Caribbean, and then disperse from there, okay? Like I said, majority actually stay in the Caribbean or actually go to South America, and you'll see a pie chart here in a second, and then some do go to North America. And if they do go to North America, most of those are going to be in the southern region where the plantations are, not as many slaves in the northern region. And then from there, the flow of goods from the Americas to Europe will be the goods, so talking kind of about the Columbian Exchange. So here's what the ships look like, okay? The ships were absolutely devastating. So the African slave ships, which the video is going to give you a better depiction of, and unfortunately, being in person, I could give you a lot better description of this. It's hard to do it on over the PowerPoint, stuff like that, but I will still try. So there were two philosophies, okay? There was tight packing and there was loose packing. So tight packing was the idea. So all the slaves were held in the below deck part of the ship. So they would load them up and they would be held below deck. Okay, so in the cubby part of the ship, where there were maybe portholes, but it was dark, it was dank. So think about when that is closed off, all those people, that body heat, people are chained together. It is very, very close quarters. So the loose packing, the theory was that if you put them in there looser, that more would survive because you were being more humane. The tight packers believed if you doubled the capacity, so if you stuffed more in there, that actually, that yes, more would die, but then more would arrive. Okay, so both inhumane, but these were kind of the two philosophies. So, but literally, the voyage could take anywhere from 4 to 10 weeks, depending on the wind patterns and just time of year and the size of the ship, the size of the load, and literally they would chain these people together and bring them out maybe a couple times a week. And so in the meantime, you're below. So imagine like being in a sauna, except that sauna smells like feces and urine. And you just want to pass out. It's disgusting, okay? And then somebody dies, and then that humidity, how quickly that body starts to rot, and it's just disgusting, okay? These ships were they smelled so bad that literally, before they would come into port, people could smell them. You could smell the ship before you could see the ship because they smelled so bad because of the feces and the urine and the bodies. And I mean, it was absolutely inhumane. I'm surprised the death rates weren't higher, to be honest with you, okay? It was absolutely terrible. Sometimes when they would take the slaves up on the decks, you know, to get them fed and to get them some air and stuff like that, some of them would try to jump overboard. You have to understand, these people were terrified. Think about it. They've never seen a big ship before. Probably to them it looked like a big sea monster. They've never seen a white man before. They're like, who is this white man? And they didn't speak the language. So they're being put on a ship. They don't know where they're going. They're thinking the worst. They're hearing rumors. They have no idea what's going on. And most of them can't swim, so they jump overboard. It's a death sentence. But to them, it's kind of like when the Mongols were coming. It was better than where it was going. Some of them would try to starve themselves to death, so they would be force-fed to keep them alive. And so it was just absolutely horrible conditions, okay? And whether the reality was whether they did loose packing or tight packing, So whether they'd loose, where they would kind of do a few less, so they would have a little bit more space. And let me tell you, this undercarriage of the ship, you couldn't fully stand up. You had maybe 5 foot clearance. So a majority of us are over 5 feet. So even me, I'm like 5'4". I would have to like hunker down. So you're sitting or you're partially standing. You don't get to lay down. Okay, like this is really, really difficult. Or with the tight packing, what they would do is they would take that 5 foot clearance and they would create a subfloor. So you had like 2.5 foot clearances. So it's imagine like you're crawling into a cubby hole. So literally those people are laying and they would create 2 layers of people. So that top picture that you see, that's like a tight packing. And they literally would just like layer them in there, like stack them in there. And again, disgusting. And you can't get up and go to the bathroom. So people just go to the bathroom on themselves. It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. And I don't know, it is absolutely mind-boggling to me how people survive this. So where did people go in the Americas? Okay, so this shows you percentage where people were going. Okay, and this is really driven by plantations and stuff. So biggest majority stayed in the Caribbean, and that's because it was tropical, and then the plantations were just huge there. Sugar, tobacco, cotton was huge. So about 41% of the Atlantic slave trade stayed in the Atlantic, or I mean stayed in the Caribbean. Okay, about 37% of slaves went to Brazil. So huge. Within the Americas, Brazil was definitely the biggest, and that's because they were the #1 producer of sugar cane. All right, so you want to remember that. That's definitely on the test. Okay. Then you had about 15% that went to the Spanish colonies. So this would be like their mines and stuff like that. And then you have about 4.5% that went to the British North America. So this would be like the southern regions like Georgia, the Carolinas, Florida, things like that, the Virginias, those plantation areas that we often think about in the South, you know, where you can go and you can see old plantations if you wanted to, or do tours or something like that, where slavery was the most rampant in the United States. Okay, so it is not to undervalue slavery in the United States, but it's just to give you a perspective of like, we think that slavery, you know, was a big deal here, and it absolutely was. You know, what happened was absolutely horrible. It shouldn't have gone on as long as it did, and stuff like that. But so if it was a problem here, then multiply that in the Caribbean and Brazil with the percentage of the population. Brazil was the last of the Americas to outlaw slavery, and that was because they were so dependent on it for sugarcane. So here's the reality. The more dependent you are on something, the harder it is to get rid of it. Right? I hope you can understand that. Like economically, it's super hard to get rid of it. So the Caribbean, a lot of their populations are going to be 90+% slaves because they were dominantly on plantations. So you're going to have very, very few Europeans, and you're going to have dominantly slaves. So that's why, like, if you go to the Caribbean today, like you go to Jamaica, if you go to Haiti, if you go to Dominican Republic, or any of these things, okay, majority of natives, people living there today, are descendants of African slaves. They're descendants of Africa, okay? Brazil, they were the very last to outlaw slavery because they were so dependent on sugar cane. It was their #1, it was their economy. They were kind of a mono economy. And so it was very hard for them to outlaw. It was very hard for the morals of slavery to overrule the pocketbook. And that's what we're going to see when we get to our Civil War. It's very hard for the morals of man to override the economic drive. And that's a horrible thing to say, but that's the truth. That's the truth of the motivator of the evil side of mankind sometimes, that we see the struggle of mankind. But this is why when you go to the Caribbean, or you see the Caribbean, a lot of the population there today is so heavily, they're descendant, there's a larger percentage that is descendant of Africa, because it goes back to slavery, because there was such a large percentage that was from Africa due to the slave trade. So how did the slave trade differ from the Sahara to the Atlantic? So I already kind of touched on this a little bit, so I'll just reiterate this a little bit, okay? So a couple things. The Atlantic slave trade was mostly men, right? It was with Europeans, and it was a shorter period of time, 1500s to 1800s, okay? Whereas the Sahara slave trade was with the Middle East, Muslim merchants. It went over a longer period of time, about 1,000 years, and it was more female because they were looking for more house servants, okay? And the volume of the Atlantic was much higher, shorter, much higher, skewed to men, European, going to the Atlantic, going to the Americas, hard manual labor. So the Sahara, Middle East was the destination, Muslim merchants, heavily female because of house servants, and again, a much slower trickle as well, so much lower volume over time. So what was life like if you were working on the plantations, okay? So the reality is that majority of the population was slaves. Even in like the Carolinas, Virginias, and stuff like that, the white population was very small. So I don't know about you, you're kind of thinking, well, if there's so many of them, why didn't they just overrun the Europeans? You know, well, it's a mental game, okay? So let me tell you like how they would set this up, okay? Because when you look at it when you're looking at like practically, you're like, well, why don't they just get together and decide to overrun the Europeans? Like they don't have enough, even if they got guns, okay, a few people die, but you're like, statistically speaking, they could overrun them. It's a mental game. It's a psychology game. They break them down. They break them down to believe they are nothing, that they're not capable of anything. And then you turn them on one another, okay? And so let me show you how they would do this, okay? So they would organize the slaves into gangs, okay, into field workers. And so each gang would have a driver. And this driver would oversee that gang. So he was responsible for that gang's production. So this driver was also a slave, okay? So you would pick one of their own, okay? And you would reward him for good work. So maybe better sleeping quarters or better clothes or better food. You know what I mean? Make him feel special. Make the others jealous of him. Make it a position of privilege. But if they failed, you punish him. So what would happen is the slave owner, who is white, okay, everything would stop and start with that driver, okay? So he would punish or reward that driver, who then that driver would punish or reward his slaves. You know what I mean? So you would have often in the fields a driver who is an African slave, okay, but put in a position above the other African slaves, whipping and beating the other slaves. And you're like, he's beating one of his own. How could he do that? It's a mental game, because if he doesn't get them to perform, what's going to happen to him? He's going to get beaten. He's going to be held responsible. But if they do well, what happens for him? He gets rewards. And then this causes them to turn on each other. Do you see what I mean? So you keep them from unifying. So it's a divide and conquer tactic. Do you know what I mean? It's a mental game, and you use it against each other. All right? Work hard to avoid punishment, and a lot of slaves died of disease. A lot of slaves died to overworking, malnutrition. Slaves died of disease. Life expectancy was short, 23 years old. Even production rates were, reproduction rates were low. It was really hard for a woman to carry to term a healthy baby, to deliver that baby, and for that baby to grow up, because the conditions were just so difficult. So most slaves were imported. Very few were born and raised in the Americas, especially in the earlier years. How did they control them? Well, they would use something called a collar. So if you ran away, they would put this slave collar, so it's like a dog collar thing, and they would chain it on you. Okay, so this would go, so you couldn't get it off, and have a lock on it, and then it would have these bells. If you ran away, literally they could hear you, and they could track you down. They would whip you, they would beat you, they could put you in hot boxes. I mean, really, you were treated like cattle. You weren't considered human, so anything goes. Anything goes. They could do whatever. They could do whatever they wanted to you, and it was absolutely horrible. And this is part of the reason that the Atlantic slave trade, that this type of slavery, that this instance of slavery, we talk about it so much, and it gets so much more attention than other instances of slavery, because of the brutality and the length of time and the volume and the justification that these are Christians who are supposed to be against slavery, yet are doing one of the most inhumane acts of slavery in history. I like this quote. Anyone can say that slavery has existed forever. Okay, even the Romans and the Greeks had it, but this kind of slavery was different. It was fixed to race. You can become a slave because you became a slave because you were black. So what made this different was, yes, slavery's been around, even like I said, all the way back to the Romans, but what made this different, it was motivated and justified by race. And so in this case, yes, this slavery was racially motivated. And that's what made it different from others, right? The racial justification, especially within religion, that we see. And like I said, how do you justify it? You justify it by saying they're not human. slavery didn't fit with Christian ideals. But again, if we say they're not really human, then it's okay. If they're not human, then therefore they can't be enslaved. And they actually saw it as, oh, see, we're helping them. They saw, here's what they saw it as. They justified it in their mind as social Darwinism. So they took it like this Darwinism idea, because I know what you're thinking. You're like, well, okay, how do you say they're not human? They stood upright, they acted like humans, okay. But here's what they did. They said they looked at the people of Africa and they said, okay, well, they live in tribes, they're not as advanced as, look at Europeans, look at all of our technology, look at our cities, look at our education, look at our religion, look at our language. So they used all the technologies and advancements of Europeans to try to say that white skin color was more advanced than dark skin color. So therefore, that people from Africa were not as developed as the white human race. Does that make sense? So therefore, it was the white man's duty to help the darker skins to become more advanced, okay? So they actually saw this, and later we'll talk about this, the white man's burden is what they'll call it. And they'll justify it as, okay? And they do this through social Darwinism. They'll just say, oh, well, the people of Africa or darker skin just weren't as developed further along as we are over time, okay? So it's our job to show them how we act and how we behave, and they will become more developed. And that's truly, I mean, that's it's sick. It's totally sick. It's totally off the wall, but that's what they believed. That's what they believed, and that's how they justify it. So if you're wondering in your mind, like, what was the thought process? I'm by no means saying it was right. I hope you get that, like 150%, like, 1,000%, so wrong. But to help you understand their thought process in their mind, this is how they justify it. So if they're not human, they're not going against God. In fact, they're doing God's work because they're helping a less developed version of themselves along the way. They're doing God's work, is what they saw it as. Okay, to round out this chapter, there were two major economic systems that will kind of take over the Americas, mercantilism and capitalism. So what's really important is that you understand the difference between these two, okay, what these two economic systems were and how they function. So let's go through those. So mercantilism and capitalism. So let me first kind of go through and talk about how each one worked. What is each one? And I believe this is one of the questions off of your homework. Oh, by the way, where it asked you to describe the lives of free people in the West Indies in the 18th century, I believe you can look in the outline, or maybe you have to go in the book, but there's 3 different groups, okay? So there's 3 groups you're going to have to look at. So I'll just give you a hint of that, and I believe in the outline or in the book, you'll have to go look for that. And so look at like the wealthy whites, little whites, free blacks, look for that and describe them, just to give you a hint on that one, okay? So if you have to compare and contrast mercantilism and capitalism, let's first start with what is the difference between them. Okay, so mercantilism is basically a relationship between the European state, meaning the government, and a business, a private business, okay? So individuals who would open a business in the Americas. So this was a way for European states, monarchs, governments, okay, to make money in the Americas without having to run it. Okay, so mercantilism is a partnership. Okay, so it's a compromise of policy. So it's a partnership between a private-owned company and the state, the European state, so Spain or Portugal or England or France or the Dutch. Okay, so here's an example. It could be a shipping industry, or it could be a bank, or it could be a plantation, or it could be a mining operation. Name it. Okay, so here's an example of what I mean. Maybe Fred, I don't know, I'm just coming up with a name, all right? Fred runs a mine, okay? But he does it under contract with the Spanish. So it's a Spanish mine, but he runs it. Do you know what I mean? So they're in business together. This can be mercantilism. Or let's say a shipping industry, okay? Let's say that the French, or let's say the English, have a bunch of cotton from the Americas or tobacco that they want to ship back, okay? But they don't want to use their ships. So they come up with a relationship with a shipping industry, a shipping company that has a fleet of ships, and that fleet of ships will ship all cash crops for the English. So they will collect those from the Americas and ship them back to England for them. So it's a business relationship between a government and a private business. Okay, so it could be shipping cargo, it could be about plantations, it could be about a certain business, it could be timber industry, something like that. Okay, what is capitalism? We hear capitalism a lot in America, in the United States. In fact, we heard a lot around election time, right? The idea of protecting capitalism, what is capitalism? And we're going to get more into capitalism. But in a basic definition, capitalism is private ownership. Okay, so where it's privately owned, so means of production are privately owned, meaning I own the business and the government doesn't own it. So maybe think about you and yourself. Like if your parent owns their own business, they work for themselves. So maybe they're an accountant or a lawyer or a doctor. Like they have their own business, or they own a store or a restaurant, or I mean, I don't even know. There could be so many other, a consulting business. I don't know. Like there could be so many other businesses out there. A real estate, in real estate, or something like that. They're a builder. That would be capitalism. Their success rides or dies with them, right? If they're successful, they have all the success. But if they fail, it's all on them. They are not in business with the government. It's all on them, okay? Which is a free market. So you saw the two types of economies or businesses going on. You saw some people that partnered with the government, which was limiting but safer, right? Because you kind of had that assurance from the government. Where capitalism, there was an opportunity to make more money, but there was more risk. Does that make sense? Because it's all on you. And you'll know that, like if your parents run their own business, right? It's scarier. When the economy gets hard, it's scary. When things are good, things are great. But when things are hard, it can be really hard because there's no one to fall back on. There's no assurance. But when you're in business with the government, when you have that partnership, you have, for instance, if you're a shipping industry, you know for sure that you're going to have business because the government has these plantations. You don't have to wonder, where's my next shipping job going to come from? It's already lined up, okay? So on one hand, capitalism's great because the sky's the limit. You're your own boss. But mercantilism is nice on one hand because there's more guarantees. So it's kind of this back or forth. So mercantilism was kind of a new economic system, and it was really a way for government controls over industries without having to be fully involved. Europeans wanted to economically extract as much goods and resources as they could from the Americas without being fully involved, without having to send as much of their resources over. So by partnering with private businesses, this was a way for them to strengthen their exports and their imports and to make money and to guarantee it without having to put out all the risk, right? By hiring private businesses. So mercantilism really was beneficial for the mother country, but also beneficial to these small businesses. So it was a way for real wealth to be measured, but without them having to give out a lot of cost. So how did these new economic changes affect Europeans? The impact made depended on people's social classes, so it really depended. Merchants invested in overseas ventures acquired wealth. So people who did this overseas, acquired wealth. Nobles whose wealth was in land were hurt by the inflation. So if you owned a lot of property in Europe and weren't invested in the Americas, this hurt you because it was cheaper and more productive in the Americas. So if you owned a lot of business or property in Europe, the inflation hurt you. It was cheaper or more productive in the Americas, so therefore you weren't as competitive in Europe, is what that means. Higher workers in towns and cities faced poverty and discontent because, again, the imports coming from the Americas were cheaper and more competitive. Peasants, the majority of Europeans, were still not affected. So day-to-day people weren't super affected.